Hi, I'm Stephen Cavey, co-founder of Ground Labs, and today we'll be talking about data protection in the Zettabyte era. The whole idea of data protection is obviously all about making sure that data is kept safe, but in an era where the volume of data is exploding. We've never stored so much data until now, and the cost of data is continually decreasing, so the incentive to store data is only greater. How do we handle this from a data protection standpoint, and what are some of the strategies that you can use to address this challenge head-on, particularly when you're dealing with requirements like the PCI DSS and many other data standards that we're seeing evolving around the world on a country-by-country basis. We'll also be talking about leveraging an evidence and data-centric approach that you can use as various different ways and strategies to overcome some of the data overflow and being overwhelmed with the volumes of data that we're seeing now in typical organizations. So let's start with the obvious driver. We've never seen so many data breaches happen at any point in time in history and compared to now. And very often the driver behind why we see data breaches fundamentally links back to poor data management practices. The fact that the organization that suffered a data breach was probably not managing and handling their data in the most optimal or correct way. And very often the data that they have lost is quite often the data they were not even aware of storing in the first place. And whilst there have been many different data breaches that have happened, the underlying fundamental concept here is that for identity theft to happen to an individual, it typically links back to an organization losing their data in the first place. And therein very much lies the challenge when it comes to why do people suffer identity fraud versus why do organizations end up losing that data in the first place. And we can unpack that a little bit more in this talk. So first and foremost, let's think about the basic problem, data. Data is collected by organizations of all types and sizes for a very broad number of reasons. And if you think about why we are collecting data, often it's to deliver a product or a service. When a customer provides their personal data to you, they're fundamentally trusting that you have the right controls in place and that you're going to do the right thing with their data as they would assume or expect. And it's very often from this that things start to go downhill. Very often organizations are storing data across many different places. And as time goes on, there is a continual and ongoing buildup of that data. And if you think about what organizations like to do with data over time is try and understand and use it to build better products, better services, and in some cases, perhaps even monetize that data. And as over time, the cost of storage has continued to go down even further, the incentive to reduce that data or do something about that overall data buildup is dramatically removed. Think about back in time, if you worked in a corporate email environment through the 1990s and 2000s, the mailbox quotas that we very often had were small, typically 10, 20, 30 megabytes. And so the way we overcame those mailbox quotas was through deletion of older emails that we no longer needed to have. And so in effect, it was forced data minimization. We were forced to reduce the amount of data that we were storing by virtue of having a quota or a limit that we had to work within. In today's environment, those limits don't exist. The cost of storage is so low and continues to go lower and lower. And so the incentive, as I said earlier, is that organizations no longer want to delete their data. If anything, they prefer to keep it for as long as they possibly can. And we have these ongoing challenges now where legislation like, standards like the PCI DSS and global privacy legislation where on a country-by-country basis you are required to know and protect the personal and sensitive data of the individuals that you are responsible for collecting, is to make sure that that data is well protected and known and should only be stored if you have a legitimate business purpose to do so. And so we have this conundrum. We effectively have very large amounts of data that organizations are storing across many different locations, on-premise, in the cloud, in structured databases, in unstructured files, across emails, across portals like SharePoint, CRMs like Salesforce, and many, many other locations. Very often without a central form of governance or a central form of oversight, and certainly not a central form of knowledge as to what is sensitive and what is not sensitive. How do we manage that? How do we address that? And how do we then comply with the myriad of standards, including the PCI DSS, when it comes to ensuring that all of our data is under control? And again, this is where some of the techniques we'll talk about in this talk will help overcome some of these issues that I'm talking about right now. So let me give you a real-life example of where this can go horribly wrong when things aren't managed appropriately. At Ground Labs, we're fortunate enough to work with many QSAs from all around the world who are part of the PCI community. And having interacted very closely with them, we've seen many different stories. And one story I'd like to talk about is a large telco. And this particular telco was being assessed by one of our QSA partners across a number of areas. And the QSA was talking to the IT and security team about where both PCI cardholder data as well as other forms of personal data are being processed and handled across the organization. And things were being manually discussed and addressed. And at a certain point during the scope assessment, the assessor identified some accounting systems that they were concerned about. They just had no visibility of it. It wasn't being actively talked about. And when they asked the organization about these systems and whether we can do some scope validation, the organization said, no, you're wasting your time. There's no cardholder data or other forms of personal data on there. They're accounting systems and they're used for reconciliation by our finance team. So don't waste your time and move on. And of course, being the good assessor that they were, they said, I trust you, but I need to verify and I need to get evidence of what you're saying. And so they went ahead and performed a data discovery process across these reconciliation systems. And as a result of that data discovery process, they found over 100 million pieces of personal and sensitive data, including cardholder data. And what's most interesting about this example is the fact that this was data that was actually being uploaded to these finance systems from their bank over a secure FTP link. And so whilst the transfer mechanism itself was relatively secure, the data was then coming to rest on a system without any protection and without any real knowledge of the types of data that were being found in these particular reconciliation files that included a full record of every transaction from the previous day's trade and included personal details of the individual associated with that transaction. And this process had been going on for several years, and hence the very large volume of personal data that had been detected on these systems. And again, that's just one very simple example of how a fairly misunderstood process is building up large volumes of risk across the organization without the organization's underlying knowledge. And this is happening across many different forms of organizations in many different types of examples. And unless evidence is gathered, rather than using assumption, then quite often this presents a potential risk that, when we've seen data breaches happen in other organizations, again, it's the data that the organization didn't know about is the data that the organization eventually lost. And this is why we need to remove assumptions from any of our scoping processes when we're going across an organization to make sure that we are not storing any unknown cardholder data or other forms of personal and sensitive data as we're looking to comply with other legislation types. So, let's talk about some of the legacy issues that very much relate to the example I just provided. Organizations, as we said before, have been gathering sensitive and personal data and collecting data from its customers for the longest time. And the data practices of the past that have been followed perhaps aren't fully understood today. And if you think about the global war for talent that's been going on at the moment, certainly what's been happening is that individuals of the past who were very aware of some of the data collection and storage practices may no longer be within the organization. And it's a new generation of people, and they're very aware of the current practices now, but they may not be aware of the practices that were followed in the past and the resulting data repositories that may still be hiding around the organization and storing very high risk levels of personal and sensitive data, including cardholder data. And so that's one very common issue. The other issue is just general poor visibility and ongoing processes to continually verify and re-identify and make sure that new data isn't ending up in places that it shouldn't be. And that can often link back to just the rapid adoption of new technology, new cloud systems, new cloud providers, digital transformation, and the many other initiatives across an organization that is resulting in new data being collected and created, which may or may not have a risk, but very often the questions aren't being asked to establish whether it is or is not risky. And then the processes to revalidate on an ongoing basis aren't being put in place to make sure that risk that may not exist today doesn't suddenly come into existence tomorrow. So at Ground Labs, we recommend our clients undergo a three-step process to overcome some of these challenges to do with the ongoing build-up of data and unknown risk that can suddenly be created within an organization. And that process is to identify, to verify, and then to protect that data. So let me go into each of the different steps that are involved here and just talk to them in a little bit more detail. So first, what we want to do when it comes to the identify process, this is really about eliminating the assumptions that we've traditionally worked on when it comes to trying to understand why and where we're storing data. Very often an organization has the belief that they know where all of their data is stored because they've gone and asked the organization. And thanks to the PCI standard and other standards, and standards that particularly require or rely on the use of independent assessors to come in and ask the difficult questions of an organization that's determining itself as to where it believes data is being stored, this can often uncover a lot of hidden facts. And let me talk you through the typical process and what that looks like. Now, very often, an organization will develop something like this, a data flow diagram. And this is an excellent thing to do. It's an excellent process to undergo. It typically involves going around the organization and doing interviews and talking to each area and asking each area of the business, what data are we collecting? Where do we store it? What do we do with it? What systems does it get entered into? And what systems are they linked up with? So where does that data eventually end up? And through that process, as you map around the organization, you eventually get a much bigger picture of where data is traversing and being stored and coming to rest and what the follow-on processes are. And then you develop effectively what you believe to be a very good, solid baseline of where data is across the organization. Now, there is nothing wrong with doing this. In fact, it's really good practice. But the problem that we often see with a process of this nature in relying solely on a data flow diagram is that it's relying on the current knowledge of the organization as to where data is stored. And this, in effect, is another word for assumptions. When you ask the head of a call center, where are we storing data, they'll tell you what they believe is happening. And it's not that they're misleading you or holding anything back. They're telling you potentially what they know is really going on, but it's not always the full picture. And this is where, thanks to standards that require the use of an independent assessor, the truth can be uncovered. And as first-hand experience at Ground Labs, again, having worked with so many QSAs, we understand that very often the story goes more like this. The organization will assess themselves, and this will be the picture. Maybe they've found some things, but they've corrected it along the way. And they will, the QSA will come on site, and this will be the baseline that the organization believes exists right now. And thanks to QSAs who perform cardholder data discovery or other forms of data discovery, such as sensitive data discovery, across the systems where the organization believes nothing was being stored, this can often then result in the real truth being uncovered. And that, in effect, often brings the organization a lot of shock. A lot of jaws are dropped. And it's actually not surprising to to assessors and to those that have been around for long enough in this space to understand that data can hide in so many different places. It can hide in shadow volumes, it can hide in deleted file space, it can hide in database temporary files, log files, it can hide in memory, and it can hide in unknown file locations that are generally not looked at. And unless you're doing a thorough process of looking across every byte of each system, you're potentially not going to uncover a lot of risk. And so this often is the traditional method versus the modern method of identifying where data is actually being stored, as opposed to where the organization believes it's really being stored. And there's a very critical difference between the two concepts. So again, eliminating assumptions, not relying on people knowledge, and removing those assumptions and basically starting from a baseline of, if we're going to make a conclusion about where data is being stored, we require evidence to back that up. Nothing more, nothing less. Now, when it comes to the PCI DSS, data discovery features quite prominently, and it is an excellent mechanism to help verify the scope of where PCI DSS applies. And it also drives the necessity of cleansing data sources where data is being stored. And it also helps to identify where cardholder data outside of the CDE may have ended up, and then drives an initiative to remediate that unnecessary cardholder data or redefine the scope of the CDE, depending on the needs of the organization. So it's all about managing the ongoing scope and using evidence to justify that as well. And so we bring it back to identify, verify, and protect as we think about the PCI DSS, and it maps very well to the requirement to identify your scope on an ongoing basis. Identifying scope is no longer a one-off exercise that we then say, right, we identified our scope 2 years ago, and so we continue to assess on that basis. The PCI DSS 4 in particular really drives the concept of making sure that after an organization undergoes changes, and on an ongoing basis, we need evidence to ensure that scope is really what it is, so that we can make sure that data is not ending up in places where it should not be or does not have the right controls in place. And so, thinking about that further, under the PCI DSS 4, data discovery can actually help across many different requirements. Whilst traditionally it was thought of as primarily around requirement 3, it now covers requirement 1, requirement 3, requirement 6, and requirement 12, where data discovery can help in aiding to both verify scope, validate that we're not storing cardholder data, and also ensure that certain operational processes involving cardholder data do not create other forms of unknown scope. And it all links back to each other. If you've effectively undergone a very thorough and comprehensive data discovery approach as part of your ongoing PCI version 4 program, this puts you in a far stronger position when you're being independently assessed, or when you're looking to justify and ensure internally that your organization is doing the right thing in accordance with your PCI obligations. Now, the other part of what PCI version 4 and many of the previous versions of PCI have often driven is making sure that things are done in a business as usual manner and not treated as a one-off project. And when it comes to ensuring that we know where our scope is and making sure that we have evidence of data storage not occurring, again, making sure that it is a continuous process is the key thing here, making sure that we identify, verify, and protect on an ongoing basis, not a once a year or just before the on-site assessment, which traditionally was a common problem, and very much explains why when we've seen independent reports on PCI compliance levels, we've at times seen the compliance levels drop. And this often comes back to the fact that organizations have lost their way in some cases around making sure that PCI compliance was being done on an ongoing basis as opposed to being treated as a project or having one-off operational processes being done and then forgotten about, particularly with a turnover of staff where we then lose knowledge, and if things are not automated and set up in an ongoing way, then it's very easy to fall out of compliance by virtue of not having continuous scope validation being done. And data discovery layers really well onto helping to make sure that the organization's scope remains as it believes and that there's no unexpected surprises into the future. And so, to wrap it up, data protection in the Zettabyte era. We've never stored so much data than ever before. And traditional practices of how we managed data in the past, and we would just store it and store it and store it and keep storing it without any thought to minimizing it or having to manage it properly, are long gone. We're now in an era where we are faced with many different forms of regulation, and the amount of data is continuing to grow exponentially across organizations of all sizes. And so we need to keep a track on that, and we need to implement processes to make sure that we are understanding where our data is, and when we understand where the data is, we're verifying whether we need to keep it or not, and we're making sure that we put the right controls to protect that data based on evidence of where the data is and is not. Remember that the evidence showing where data is not being stored is as equally important as when we do actually find data that we didn't expect to be stored. And so the two go hand in hand in making sure that we build up ongoing evidence to prove what we are and are not doing with data, particularly of a personal or sensitive nature, and in the context of the PCI DSS, cardholder data as well. And it all fits neatly into the same strategy when you're thinking about your data as a whole. What needs the right levels of protection? What doesn't need the right levels of protection? Do we have the controls in place in the right areas of our business to ensure that we can meet our ongoing obligations under the various security and privacy standards that now exist on a global basis? And so with that said, I'd like to thank you very much for sitting in on this session. And at Ground Labs, we've provided some URLs here with some further follow-up materials if you are interested. Otherwise, I wish you all the best and good luck on your data protection journey. Thank you.